Iran, Saudi Arabia rapprochement. Could peace between these two nations bring regional stability? Hello, I'm Arnold Nair, and this is The Heat. Iran and Saudi Arabia have taken the next steps in restoring diplomatic ties. Delegations from both countries started the process of reopening their respective embassies on Tuesday. The two nations reconciled last month after China brokered an agreement to re-establish bilateral relations. We begin with this report from CGTN's Huang Yue.
In a joint statement, Saudi Arabia and Iran agreed to launch arrangements to reopen embassies and consulates within 2 months. The foreign minister said the two sides will examine ways of expanding cooperation, including resuming flights, bilateral visits of official and private sector delegations. They also agreed to facilitate the granting of visas for the two countries' citizens. Chinese State Councilor and Foreign Minister Qin Gang also held talks with the two foreign ministers. The meetings follow a landmark agreement brokered by China last month for Saudi Arabia and Iran to restore diplomatic ties. Qin said China highly appreciates the high-level interactions between Saudi Arabia and Iran and supports the two sides in mapping out the plans for future development of bilateral relations. He also emphasized that the regional countries should get rid of external interference and hold the future and destiny of the Middle East in their own hands. Both Saudi Arabia and Iran have expressed their appreciation for China's mediation. Some experts say the restoration of diplomatic ties between Saudi Arabia and Iran is of great significance not only to the region, but also to the world. By improving the relations, the two countries are said to have opened the door to peace in the Middle East and set an example of settling disputes via dialogue. China says as a trustworthy friend of both Saudi Arabia and Iran, it will continue to play a constructive role in the process. Hong Yue, CGTN, Beijing.
Over the weekend, Iranian-backed Houthis and Saudi leaders gathered to discuss a peace proposal in Yemen, where they've been on opposite sides in a brutal civil war. There is hope the deal reached between Saudi Arabia and Iran will lead to progress on ending that conflict. The United Nations calls it the world's worst humanitarian crisis. To discuss this and more, let's bring in our guests. Joining us here in Washington, D.C., Salman al-Ansari is a Saudi political researcher and commentator. Also in the U.S. Capitol, Barbara Slavin is a distinguished fellow of Middle East and North Africa at the Stimson Center. From Virginia, we're joined by Trita Parsi. He is the executive vice president at the Quincy Institute. And from Tehran, Iran, we're joined by Ali Akbar Dareni, who is a researcher and writer at the Center for Strategic Studies in Tehran. Welcome to all of you to the show. Ali Akbar Dareni, let me start with you, and let's start with the situation in Yemen, where that war has been going on for 8 years. We have the two sides, the Houthis backed by Iran, and then we have the Yemeni government backed by Saudi Arabia. But now they are talking about peace. Houthi leaders met with Saudi officials and they are talking peace. It's a major development. As I said, this war has been going on for 8 years, and as we reported earlier, the UN calls it the worst humanitarian disaster. Where do you see this peace effort going?
I expect this process to continue, although Iran and Saudi Arabia are rivals and will remain rivals, but it depends on their strategic calculus, whether this peace process being brokered by China is going to be durable or not. There are now visible signs that Iran and Saudi Arabia have come to the agreement that they will gain more if they cooperate instead of remaining in conflict. And China now is a power both of them can trust. And this is China that has brokered a deal that can remain durable for some time. We have to see what are the motives of Iran and Saudi Arabia to see whether this is going to be a durable process or not, because there are spoilers that can make the process difficult. And but I see that the U.S. hegemony is the U.S. hegemonic world order is crumbling, and the unipolar system is a multipolar system is replacing it. China has brought reconciliation between Iran and Saudi Arabia. It is promoting peace, but the US has remained the primary driver of instability and war in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia needs to implement its 2030 vision, and it cannot succeed in implementing this strategic plan and attract foreign investment without having normal relations with Iran and without ending the disastrous war in Yemen. So the Saudis are looking for an exit ramp to be able to attract foreign investment and be able to pursue their plans. They cannot achieve those goals while their economic and oil installations are being targeted by the Houthis. So the Saudis have come to the conclusion that, first of all, they can no longer trust the United States as a security guarantor, because the Houthi attacks on Saudi Aramco oil facilities in 2019 and America's lack of intervention in that proved that they can no longer rely on the United States. And in this era of transition towards a multipolar system, the Saudis need to diversify their foreign policy alliances, and now they see that they can gain more if they cooperate with Iran instead of being in conflict.
Okay, Salman Al-Ansari, what do you make of that? Ali Akbar Dareni telling us there that Saudi Arabia sees far more advantages in re-establishing relations with Iran rather than maintaining the status quo, and the fact that Saudi Arabia, as he put it, doesn't trust the United States right now as a security guarantor.
Yeah, thank you so much. Just to correct your honorable guest, the attack that happened against the oil installations in Saudi Arabia came from the north, not from the Houthis. So it was from Iran, basically, through their Iraqi militias. Anyhow, with regards to the Saudi position, the Saudi position has been very clear. We have a development model that we want to advance. And the Saudi finance minister lately, he actually said, Mohammed Al-Jad'an, he said Saudi Arabia may invest in Iran very quickly. That's what he said, very quickly. So, and we all know that the Saudi exports globally amount to over $260 billion. Iran's export is below 16 billion. So the economic scene in both countries are very different. However, I think, and I'm not being hyperbolic here, but I think Iran can become the second biggest economy in the region and a member of the G20 if they forget about the nonsense of their dogmatic revolutions. And if they do so, that will definitely be at the benefits for everybody.
Right.
And we know that the Iranian economy is in a very difficult time, 45% of the population under the poverty line due to the IRGC controls of half of the economy. So imagine the kind of economy they have and imagine the kind of future it will have. So definitely we want Iran to be a normal nation, not a revolutionary one.
Okay, Salman, I have a specific question on the Yemeni peace deal that's being talked about right now. What's on the table right now is a minimum 8-month ceasefire and talks that could continue for up to 2 years. The Houthi leader, Mohammed Abdul Salam, he outlined his movement's demands. This is what they are. Let's listen.
Our just demands are stopping the aggression completely, lifting the blockade completely, paying the salaries of all Yemeni employees from oil and gas revenues for all Yemeni employees, as well as the exit of foreign forces from Yemen, compensations and reconstruction.
So, Salman, what do you make of these demands? I mean, is it a reasonable basis for negotiations? And how will the Saudis respond to that?
Yeah, great. So basically, we have to explain the thing with regards to Yemen. Saudi Arabia has been there to protect the Yemeni government, the legitimate government of Yemen, under the 2216 resolution of the United Nations. And gladly, the Saudis have freed 80% of the Yemeni land, but that's geographically speaking. But the population-wise, it is actually under the Houthis. The 80% is under the Houthis, and the 20% is under the Yemeni government. So when it comes to this issue, I think we have to go back to the deal. There are like the Iran, Saudi, China deal. There are, I think, two parts of the agreement, I suppose. The one that was released, and there's another one that is undisclosed. The released statement talked about the bilateral relations and nothing about the regional issues, such as the Iranian militias in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria, which I'm sure that the three parties covered these issues without disclosing them for different considerations. We can see that through the Saudi opening to the Syrian regime, plus the Saudi opening to the Houthis in Yemen, etc. And I don't think the Saudis did these openings without some guaranteed compromises from the Iranian regime. And we know that the Iranians know exactly what the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia wants. It's a very simple request. Stop supporting terrorism and stop interfering in domestic affairs of the Arab world.
All right, Barbara, great to have you with us. This conflict in Yemen, it's been described as a proxy war between Iran and Saudi Arabia. What do you make of these fledgling efforts at peace?
I think it's much too simplistic to call it a proxy war. I mean, Yemen has had many conflicts, many civil conflicts for decades, and the Houthis are not proxies of Iran. They have gotten a lot of support from Iran, particularly after Saudi Arabia intervened and began to bomb the country. So I think that's too simplistic. But I'm hopeful, and as soon as I heard the news about this agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, I wrote that this was incredibly constructive. It was good to see China play this role, and we should, of course, recognize that these negotiations had gone on for several years, and that Iraqis and Omanis had played an important part. But nevertheless, China was there to finalize the agreement. And I would like to see China do more. I would like to see China now encourage Iran to revive the Iran nuclear deal, which, as far as I know, China has not done. If China is going to play this important diplomatic role in the Middle East, then it should be a real force for constructive policies and for conflict resolution.
Right, Barbara, I want to get to the Iran nuclear deal a little later in the show, but if we look at some of the specifics in this this peace effort, there is a prisoner exchange which is planned for Thursday this week. The Houthis will release 181 prisoners. Government forces will release 706 prisoners. How significant is this in terms of building confidence between the two sides?
Oh, I think it's essential. And also the fact that planes can now land in Sana'a, that the blockade of the country has been eased. Let's also mention, by the way, that the United States has been part of the effort and helped bring about an initial ceasefire some months ago. Tim Lenderking, the U.S. envoy for Yemen, I believe, is headed back to the region. So this was not done, you know, out of thin air. All of these achievements take a lot of work by a lot of people. And I don't know who said it first, but, you know, it's amazing what you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit. So right now, China is getting some credit. That's fine. But there have been many, many actors, UN, of course, trying to end the war in Yemen, really almost since it began.
Trudy Parsi, the United States has been heavily involved in this war in Yemen, supplying weapons to Saudi Arabia, which in turn have been used against the Yemenis. You did an interview with The Intercept, the online news site, about this, and you said that in order to serve as an effective mediator, you need a reputation of being fair. The United States, you say, has made it clear it doesn't want to be fair. It has not been fair between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and it wouldn't be impartial between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So, given that, where does that leave the United States? Can it play a meaningful role?
Well, the United States has shifted its position over the course of the last couple of decades. In the past, it did try to be fair, and it was successful in a couple of instances. And in many ways, if you wanted to have mediation, a natural stop for such an effort was Washington. That is no longer the case. In Israel-Palestine, obviously, it's very clear. The U.S. does not pretend to be an impartial broker. In the case of Saudi Arabia and the Houthis, that's also very clear. Just take a look at the numerous condemnations from the U.S. side about Houthi attacks and the complete silence from the United States on the Biden administration when it comes to Saudi attacks. So it's been very clear the United States is there to support its allies. It's not there to be an impartial broker. And we saw the limits of that approach. It is true that Tim Lenneking and others have played a role, a helpful role in many instances in bringing about the truce, etc. But to be able to move this beyond the finishing line, you needed an actor that could be trusted by both sides, that had a reputation of being impartial. And that is something that the Chinese have, at least so far. Hopefully that will not change. And the United States, because of its many, many engagements in the region and because of a decision of what its strategy wants to be, it has chosen actively not to be impartial.
Barbara Slavin, what's your view on that? That the United States is not exactly in a position to broker peace here, to help with brokering peace?
Yeah, well, I don't like to disagree with my good friend Trita, and we generally do agree. But in this case, I think he's being a little harsh. The U.S. did reduce its arms sales to the Saudis for use in Yemen. There were restrictions placed on the use of U.S. Arms in Yemen, and the U.S. stopped providing targeting information to the Saudis, which it had done early on. So I think, you know, the lack of enthusiasm for the war in Yemen has been very clear, especially since the Biden administration came in. But Trita is right. I mean, the U.S. could not broker a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran because it has no relationship with Iran anymore. And for that, I look at many historical reasons, but I especially fault the Trump administration, which withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal when Iran was in full compliance. And we not only lost the nuclear deal, but we lost the only channel of communication, direct channel of communication with Tehran. And it was a huge mistake, and we're still paying the price for that. So this particular agreement obviously was easier for China to put together. Let's remember also that China is now the main economic partner for both Iran and Saudi Arabia, and the U.S., because of its sanctions, does not have an economic relationship to speak of, and in fact is trying to strangle the Iranian economy.
Right. Ali Akbar Durrani, much of what we see happening right now comes, of course, off the back of that Chinese-brokered peace deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which is leading to the restoration of diplomatic relations. Embassies will be reopened, direct flights will be resumed. But you talked earlier on about a question mark over the durability of this kind of agreement, and that there are spoilers which could threaten the relationships that's beginning right now. Tell us more about that.
Israel is the fiercest enemy of peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia. This deal brokered by China is greatly disliked by Israel, to some extent by the United States, but the United States remains on the sideline, but Israel is very much scared of this process of reconciliation. At the same time, the United States also is not happy because it has no role to play. And now Iran has come to the conclusion that the best policy at this point is to push for a de-Americanization of the regional security order, because Iran looks at the United States as the primary driver of instability in this region. It has worked to pit Saudi Arabia against Iran because their interests will be met if there is conflict and lack of peace. But China, on the other hand, has been driving peace, making peace, and making all sides winners, while this has not been pursued by the Americans, and Israelis are now having hard times. Iran may not be able to prevent the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel at the end, but it may delay security cooperation between them. The Raisi administration's foreign policy strategies of looking to the East and neighborhood policy require it to have good relations with all 15 neighbors, including Saudi Arabia. And now what Iran is looking for is for a new regional security order with the involvement of non-Western powers, including the United States.
Okay. Salman, from a Saudi perspective, what motivated Saudi Arabia to restore diplomatic relations with Iran? I mean, these countries have been very bitter rivals, and as Trita Parsi pointed out in a previous show on this particular subject, they remain bitter rivals, but they now have a means to manage that rivalry.
Yeah, I just would like to comment about what Mr. Ali has said with regards to inserting Israel to the conflict between Saudi Arabia and Iran. I don't think this has any backing at all whatsoever. Like, at the end of the day, Saudi Arabia was at the receiving end of the Iranian aggression, and we all know any country Iran touches turns into a failed state. So we don't want to keep having the same kind of policies with Iran. So right now, we are seeing this momentum. But there are, just to answer your question, there are two major differences between this deal and the previous one. In fact, it's considered to be a big thing because it's guaranteed by China and brokered and mediated by China. The second thing is the fact that it came from the hardliners and the conservatives in Iran, not the so-called moderates. So, and I recall the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman when he said in his first interview, when he spoke about Iran, that the Iranian tactic was to warm up relations with Saudi Arabia when they have a moderate regime, then revoke all the agreements when they have conservative ones. So right now, the conservatives are the ones who took this step, which is somehow more assuring that they will uphold to their promises. And we all wish. And at the same time, China is almost the one and only country that has substantial leverage over Iran, besides the fact that China considers the Middle East as a very vital region for their economy. 40% of their energy comes from the region, and the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, will go through both Iran and Saudi Arabia. So there is an intrinsic interest for Beijing to mediate between the kingdom and Iran. And let's just hope that the Saudis and Iranians will find a common ground through which they can both focus on nothing but economic empowerment and prosperity, rather than just warfare and conflict.
Barbara, the United States has, of course, had enormous influence in the Middle East and continues to have that influence, for good or for bad, depending on one's perspective. But some of that changed during the Obama administration, didn't it, when President Obama started talking about the pivot to Asia, about refocusing American interests in Asia rather than in the Middle East. I mean, this is how one Iranian analyst, Saeed Mustafa Koshem, put it. Let's listen to him.
For decades, the United States claimed that if it's not for its role in the West Asian region in the Middle East, and if it leaves the region, there would be a vacuum that would end up in strifes, conflicts, tensions, and wars in the region. But it's proved now that it is actually the U.S. absence that would help regional stability and security. And it's in the absence of the U.S. and NATO that regional countries can resolve problems peacefully.
So, Barbara, what are your thoughts on that statement?
I think it's a bit much. Look, the United States has guaranteed the freedom of navigation through the Persian Gulf for decades, ever since the Brits left the region back in the 1960s and the 1970s. The U.S. is a very important security guarantor. China is not in a position to play that role at this point, and hasn't asked to play that role at this point. It's been a free rider on the security provided by the United States. But I agree that some U.S. steps, particularly the decision to invade Iraq in 2003, were enormously destabilizing and were a great strategic error and a humanitarian error on many levels. And we're, I think, still paying the price for that very rash decision by the Bush administration.
Right, and the decision to violate the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal.
Yes, and as I mentioned before, the Trump's decision, I think, was also enormously damaging, because we had a diplomatic agreement that was not only among the P5+1, enshrined in a UN Security Council resolution. So, I mean, Trump did enormous damage. Obama, yes, talked about the pivot. Trump, with his erratic behavior and with his siding with Saudi Arabia, UAE against Iran in a really gratuitous way, I would say, also did a lot of damage and left the situation such that even Joe Biden could not repair it.
Trita, talking about the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, the United States is now proposing an interim deal. It's been talking to its partners in Europe about this. It's been talking to Israel about this as well. And what that includes is some sanctions relief in return for a freezing of the nuclear program. Where do you see that going?
I've always been skeptical about essentially a smaller deal in the past, because it's largely been because of the lack of political will to do an adequate deal. At this point, however, I'm warming up to the idea that there may be a necessity of some form of a smaller deal. Because from the American side, sanctions relief has started to be somewhat meaningless. The carrot that they could have been no longer is the case. So it doesn't incentivize the Iranians as much. And as has been pointed out on this program, the Iranians are now looking east. They don't have any faith or confidence that trade with Europe or with the West can be resumed in a stable way. On the other hand, the Iranians nevertheless need some sanctions relief for their trade with the East. Without that sanctions relief, there will continue to be specific limitations, and specifically for their trade with the region. The strategy of Tehran to improve relations with the neighbors is also being hampered by U.S. sanctions. So the Iranians still need sanctions relief, but what the U.S. can offer is going to be roughly 10% of what the original JCPOA put forward. So given the inability of putting forward something more, but still the significant need for making sure that the situation doesn't get out of control, a smaller arrangement may be worth pursuing, not necessarily as an alternative to the JCPOA, but as an intermediary step.
Ali Akbar Darani, very quickly, I've only got about 20 seconds. Would Iran be open to a smaller deal?
No, Iran will only agree if sanctions are going to be lifted, but the United States has shown no willingness to revive the 2015 JCPOA. Instead, it has been looking for a JCPOA number 2 that seeks to disarm Iran. That has not happened and is not going to happen.
Okay.
So Iran is trying to nullify sanctions.
I don't want to use the last 20 seconds to go to Barbara Slavin on this, Barbara.
It's not true. The Biden administration has been trying to revive the JCPOA since it came into office. And Iran is the one that keeps raising extraneous demands that have prevented it from being revived.
Okay, we are going to have to leave it there. Thanks to all of you for being with us. Time has caught up with us. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.